Chinese government itself, the CCP's propaganda arm, is no longer talking about overtaking the United States economically. That should tell you everything you need to know, because the propaganda always overshoots, and now they're starting to dial it back really, really significantly. As Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics are local. And the way the Chinese system consolidated in the post-Maoist era is you had a guy by the name of Deng Xiaoping, who picked who would rule China for the next 20 years. Two guys, Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao. But he knew that he wasn't smart enough to see past 20 years. So he told those two factions that they then had to come up with a compromise candidate to succeed them. And that person is Xi Jinping, the current chairman. Xi spent the first years of his term doing a purge of anyone in the country who was a potential political opponent, and then spent the next 5 years of his term purging everyone from the system who was capable of independent thought to make sure there would never be a challenge at all. And now he sits atop the heap, but there's no one in the country who is intellectually capable of helping him, and no one in the bureaucracy wants to bring him news that might elicit an opinion because they don't know what's going to piss him off. So we're seeing a government breakdown from the inside at the very, very top, because all policy starts and stops with one person. And even if he was the smartest person in human history, he couldn't manage a system this large. But at the same time, you've got this dependence upon the United States for all things energy and food and manufacturing. So the solution for the last few years has been blatant nationalistic, narcissistic, lambasting propaganda in order to make sure that the population is fully on board with him. That works until it doesn't. And one of the things that we've seen in just the last few days is Xi has reassigned a guy by the name of Zhao Lining, who used to be the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's the guy who popularized the term wolf warrior diplomacy, which is basically you throw everything in everyone's face all the time, blame everyone for everything, make up stuff on the cuff if it sounds good to make someone look bad. And he has been the forefront for the anti-American propaganda throughout the Chinese system for the last 3 years. Well, now he's been assigned to basically border patrol. It's difficult to come up with a more blatant downsizing of somebody's authority. So it is possible that Xi has realized just how deep the doo-doo is and is starting to dig out, but I'd argue that it's too late. One of the few things that the American political spectrum agrees on is that China needs to be taken down a few notches. And so we're seeing a steady crunching of American policy down on China, specifically with tech in the last couple of months, but we're going to see it with energy going in the next couple of months because of some of the shifts that are happening in the Ukraine war. Remember that we now have a price cap and no insurance for any Russian exports. That means that stuff is going to fall off the market pretty soon because no one can insure the ships to make sure that they leave. That's probably going to cost the Chinese 2 to 3 million barrels a day of Russian crude. That is more than enough to cause an energy-induced depression that lasts several years, even assuming the United States stops with its onslaught on everything else. It's the U.S. military's job to be prepared for contingencies, so no criticism there, but I don't think there's going to be a war. Every assumption Beijing has made about how war happens has been proven wrong by the Ukraine war, and they now need a completely new plan. It's possible that Xi has been so isolated for so long that he's forgotten a little bit about the basic position of China in international affairs, but I don't think so. And I think he knows that if there is a war, that is the end of China as a country, as an industrialized entity. It would be national suicide. So I personally find that very unlikely. The only reason that I can think of that the Chinese would do it anyway is if you know in your heart in China that the end is near anyway: demographic collapse, energy crisis, food crisis, trade crisis. Then maybe there's something to be said for pulling the trigger, because at least then you get to write the narrative of what's next. And if you can do that and keep the CCP in power for the low cost of 500 million dead Chinese, then maybe it's worth considering. The smart way to fight China is not within its own coastal waters. It does have a large navy. They don't have much range, but there's a bunch of ships. The smart thing would be to put 2 destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy flows. China imports 80% of its energy. 75% of that comes from just the Persian Gulf, and most of the rest comes from Africa, so it's on the same route through the Indian Ocean. So 2 ships would be enough to send it to zero. and the Chinese war machine would stop within days, and the Chinese economy would stop within weeks, and the Chinese population would be starving within months. It'd be very, very easy. And Xi knew this 3 years ago. Whether or not he still remembers it now that there's no one reminding him of it is an open question. We just don't know. But if there was a war, China would fall very, very, very quickly. That doesn't mean that they couldn't inflict damage. That's not what I'm saying. All of Japan and Korea and Taiwan are within range of their Air Force and their missiles. It would hurt. But destroying China completely as a modern system would be child's play. As for what the Americans would feel, there's really only one sector where we would feel it. That's electronics and manufacturing. And there is no way around that, especially when it comes to things like computing and assembly. Now, pros and cons. Pros, China is not very high value add. There's nothing that China makes that can't be made somewhere else with a more sustainable supply chain at a lower price point. We've learned that because of COVID. Cons, the sunk cost of the industrial plant in China is immense, and it would take the United States at least 5 years to rebuild those supply chains in the Western Hemisphere, noticeably in NAFTA, and that would hurt. There's no way around that. That said, after 5 years of reindustrialization, North America would have experienced 5 years of the fastest growth in its history, and at the end of the day would have supply chains that are shorter, simpler, that employ locals, that sell to locals, that are cleaner, that use the most advanced technology that's available of the day, and are largely immune to international shocks. It's a transition we have to go through one way or another because the Chinese demographic picture is utterly unsustainable. It is a death pact. A war would speed that up, obviously. So I would argue that the North Americans need to do this regardless, and the sooner they get started and the faster they go, the less painful it will be. But one of the fun things about when you plan to, say, like take over Taiwan is you make certain assumptions about how things are going to go, and the Chinese have been making certain assumptions for 45 years, and the Russians have now proved all of them wrong. So for one, the Chinese thought this would be a fast war, and they looked forward to the Ukraine war being a template for Taiwan. And here we are, dragged on a year later, and Russia's not doing great. And they always knew that the Taiwan war would be tougher than Ukraine because you can walk to Kiev, and the Ukrainians have only been preparing for 8 years. You got to swim to Taipei, and the Taiwanese have been preparing for 45. So, assumption one, gone. Assumption two, Russian weapons are great, so let's steal the IP and clone them and outfit our equipment. They spent 30 years and $3 trillion US doing that, and now they're having some very serious buyer's remorse. Assumption number three, Russia is too important. No one will sanction it. Well, that went out the window. And say what you will about the Russian economy. It's corrupt, it's inefficient, but wow, is it a massive producer of energy and foodstuffs. China's the world's largest importer of both. Hell, they import 80% of the inputs that allow them to grow their own food. You take the sanctions that are on Russia, you put them on China, you get a deindustrialization collapse complete with a famine that kills 500 million people within a year. So every assumption the Chinese have made, Putin has proven wrong. And the Chinese are not happy about that because it now means they have to start completely over, but now they're in a one-man dictatorship and there's no one left to come up with a plan B.